December 26, 1996. Boulder, Colorado. A 911 call at 5:52 a.m. reports a missing 6-year-old girl and a ransom note demanding $118,000. Within 8 hours, police discover the child's body in the basement of her own home. The kidnapping scenario failed to function as genuine. The ransom note proved incapable of producing the outcome it described. And 28 years later, despite thousands of hours of investigation, hundreds of interviews, and advanced DNA technology that didn't exist in 1996, no one has been charged with the murder of JonBenét Ramsey. This case appears to be one of the most thoroughly investigated crimes in American history. The Boulder Police Department collected over 1,500 pieces of evidence. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed every detail. 4 separate district attorneys have overseen the investigation. DNA profiles have been tested and retested using evolving technology. A grand jury spent 13 months examining evidence and voted to indict. Yet the case remains officially unsolved. Here is the unresolved paradox. This is not a case lacking evidence. This is not a case lacking suspects. This is not a case lacking investigative resources. This is a case where abundant evidence failed to produce clarity, where intensive investigation failed to generate resolution, and where every technological advance has added complexity rather than answers. How does a case with this much attention, this much evidence, and this much scrutiny remain fundamentally unresolved after nearly 3 decades? The answer lies not in what happened on December 26, 1996, but in what happened to the investigation itself. This documentary does not pursue theories about who killed JonBenét Ramsey. It does not accuse individuals or guide viewers toward conclusions about guilt or innocence. Instead, we examine something equally important: why a criminal investigation can accumulate evidence without achieving resolution. Why institutional decisions made in the first hours can determine the outcome years later. And why some cases, despite massive resources and public attention, remain logically incomplete. This is a case study of investigative limitation, not criminal behavior. What you're about to see is an examination of how evidence can be collected but not preserved, how resources can be deployed but not effectively directed, and how a case can be thoroughly investigated while remaining thoroughly unresolved. Most critically, we will explore how the structure of criminal investigation itself, designed for linear evidence chains and clear perpetrator identification, can become inadequate when confronted with ambiguous evidence and institutional pressure for rapid resolution. The victim at the center of this investigative failure was JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, 6 years old in December 1996. She lived with her parents, John and Patricia Ramsey, and her 9-year-old brother, Burke, in a large Tudor-style home on 15th Street in Boulder. The house had 15 rooms spread across 7,000 square feet, including a complex basement with multiple storage areas, a boiler room, and a small wine cellar that would later become central to the investigation. JonBenét attended High Peaks Elementary School, where teachers described her as energetic and social. She participated in her church's children's choir and was preparing for the Christmas pageant at St. John's Episcopal Church. She took violin and piano lessons. She competed in child beauty pageants, winning several titles across Colorado. Her participation in pageants would later become a focus of media coverage and speculation about motive. But in December 1996, it was simply one activity among many in the life of a 6-year-old girl who enjoyed performing. Understanding the family structure becomes relevant not for assigning responsibility, but for comprehending how investigators would later interpret behavior and evidence. Her father, John Ramsey, was president and CEO of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had recently become a billion-dollar subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. His business success placed the family in Boulder's affluent community, where violent crime was rare and police resources were primarily directed toward property crimes and university-related incidents. Her mother, Patricia, known as Patsy, was a former Miss West Virginia who had graduated from West Virginia University with a journalism degree. She was active in church and community organizations, managing household activities, and coordinating JonBenét's various lessons and competitions. Her background in journalism would later influence how investigators interpreted her behavior during interviews, with some viewing her media awareness as evidence of manipulation rather than professional training. The family had experienced significant tragedy before. In 1992, John's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, from his first marriage, died in a car accident at age 22. The loss had deeply affected the family, particularly John, who had been extremely close to his daughter. This prior experience with sudden death would later factor into behavioral analysis of how the family responded to JonBenét's disappearance, though experts disagreed about whether their reactions were consistent with innocence or guilt. In December 1996, the Ramsey family was preparing for Christmas vacation. They planned to fly to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan on December 26th, then continue to Florida for a Disney cruise. Christmas Day 1996 proceeded normally, following patterns that would later be scrutinized for any deviation from routine that might suggest premeditation or unusual stress. The family opened presents at home in the morning. JonBenét received a bicycle she had wanted. The house was decorated with Christmas lights and ornaments. Presents were arranged under a large tree in the living room. That evening, they attended a Christmas party at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends who lived nearby in Boulder. According to multiple witnesses at the party, nothing seemed unusual. The family appeared relaxed and happy. JonBenét played with other children, ate from the buffet, and showed no signs of distress or illness. Burke played video games with other children. The parents socialized with friends who had known them for years. It was, by all accounts, a typical Christmas celebration among families who knew each other well. The Ramseys left the party around 9:30 p.m. The drive home was short, just a few minutes through quiet Boulder streets lined with houses decorated for the holiday. According to John and Patsy's later statements to police, both children fell asleep in the car during this brief drive. John carried JonBenét inside and up to her second-floor bedroom, laying her on her bed, still wearing the clothes she had worn to the party, a red turtleneck and black velvet pants. Burke walked to his room. The parents went to their third-floor master bedroom. By 10 p.m., according to the family's account, everyone in the house was asleep. This timeline would later become significant because evidence discovered during the autopsy suggested it was incomplete. At the time, however, this account seemed unremarkable, a typical evening for a family returning home from a holiday gathering. At approximately 5:30 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey woke up to begin preparations for the family's planned trip to Michigan. They were scheduled to leave by 7 a.m. to catch their flight. She got dressed, applied makeup, and headed downstairs to start coffee and complete final packing. As she descended the spiral staircase from the second floor to the first, she discovered 3 pieces of paper laid out on the lower steps, positioned where they could not be missed. It was a ransom note, handwritten in black ink, nearly 3 pages long. The discovery of this note represented the first moment when what appeared to be a family vacation departure became something entirely different. The note was addressed to John. It claimed to be from a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. It stated that JonBenét had been kidnapped and demanded exactly $118,000 for her safe return, a sum that would later prove significant because it closely matched John's recent bonus from Axis Graphics. The note warned the family not to contact police or FBI, threatening that JonBenét would be beheaded if they did. It instructed John to withdraw the money in specific denominations, $100,000 in $100 bills and $18,000 in $20 bills, and promised a phone call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with delivery instructions. The note was signed SBTC, initials that have never been definitively explained. The content of the note would later undergo extensive analysis by forensic linguists, handwriting experts, and behavioral analysts. At the moment of discovery, however, Patsy's immediate response was to check JonBenét's bedroom. The bed was empty. At 5:52 a.m., despite the ransom note's explicit warning not to contact authorities. Patsy called 911. This decision would later become a point of debate, whether it represented the natural response of a panicked parent or evidence that the note was not genuine, since someone who had actually kidnapped JonBenét would presumably follow through on their threats. The 911 call was recorded and would later undergo extensive audio analysis. "We have a kidnapping," Patsy told the dispatcher, her voice clearly distressed. "There's a note left and our daughter is gone." John briefly took the phone to confirm the situation. The dispatcher advised them that police were on the way and told them not to touch anything in the house. This represented the last moment when the case could have proceeded according to standard kidnapping protocols. What happened next would fundamentally shape every aspect of the investigation that followed. Officer Rick French of the Boulder Police Department arrived at 5:59 a.m., just 7 minutes after the 911 call. His response time was excellent. His understanding of what he was walking into would prove incomplete. Officer French entered the Ramsey home expecting a kidnapping situation. His first responsibility was to secure the scene and begin a systematic search for the missing child. Standard protocol for kidnapping cases involves immediately limiting access to preserve potential evidence of the perpetrator's presence, interviewing family members separately to establish a timeline, and coordinating with specialized units trained in kidnapping response. None of this occurred. Instead, within the first hour, the house filled with people. John had called his pilot to arrange a flight, not to Michigan as originally planned, but to Atlanta, where Patsy's family lived. This change in destination would later be interpreted by some investigators as evidence of flight from prosecution, though it could equally represent a desire to be near extended family during a crisis. John had also called Fleet and Priscilla White, who came immediately. Patsy called other friends, John and Barbara Fernie, and Reverend Roll Hoverstock from their church. By mid-morning, more than a dozen people were moving through the house, using bathrooms, making coffee in the kitchen, sitting in various rooms, and attempting to comfort the distraught parents. This decision not to secure the scene represents what we might call the first investigative crossroads, a moment where protocol diverged from standard practice in ways that would have lasting consequences. In kidnapping cases, limiting access to the scene preserves potential evidence of the perpetrator's presence. Every additional person introduces fibers, DNA, fingerprints, and other trace evidence that can complicate forensic analysis. The Boulder Police Department's approach appeared to be treating this as a kidnapping in progress rather than a potential crime scene. This distinction might seem minor, but it fundamentally altered how evidence would be collected and preserved. In a kidnapping in progress, the priority is facilitating ransom payment and recovering the victim alive. In a crime scene, the priority is preserving evidence for eventual prosecution. The decision to allow multiple people access to the house meant that any physical evidence collected later could be challenged as potentially irrelevant contamination from well-meaning friends and family rather than from the perpetrator. Officer French did conduct a search of the house, checking rooms on multiple floors and examining the basement. The basement had a complex layout with several storage areas: Burke's train room where elaborate model railroad tracks were set up, a boiler room, and at the far end, past the boiler room, a small wine cellar with a wooden door. French approached this door and found it secured with a wooden latch from the outside. He opened the door briefly, saw that the room was dark, but did not turn on the light or step inside. The room appeared empty to him. He closed the door and continued his search of other areas. This moment quietly altered the trajectory of the entire investigation. JonBenét's body was lying on the floor of that wine cellar, approximately 6 feet from where Officer French stood. Had he turned on the light and entered the room, the body would have been discovered within an hour of the 911 call. The scene would have been immediately secured as a homicide investigation. Evidence would have been photographed and collected according to protocol before contamination occurred. Instead, the body remained undiscovered for more than 7 hours, while the scene above continued to be compromised by foot traffic from family and friends. Every minute that passed represented evidence being altered, moved, or destroyed, by people who had no idea they were walking through a crime scene. The failure to discover the body immediately also meant that the investigation proceeded under false assumptions. For 7 hours, everyone believed they were dealing with a kidnapping. Resources were allocated accordingly. Behavioral analysis focused on ransom scenarios. The family's actions were interpreted through the lens of kidnapping dynamics rather than homicide investigation. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at the Ramsey home around 8 a.m. She was assigned to manage the scene and wait with the family for the promised ransom call. The ransom note had specified that kidnappers would call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with delivery instructions. Arndt found herself in an increasingly difficult situation, managing a house full of civilians while waiting for contact from kidnappers who might never call. 8 o'clock came and went with no call. 9 o'clock passed. 10 o'clock passed. The promised deadline expired with no contact from any kidnappers. The silence became increasingly ominous. This absence of follow-up contact should have been a significant investigative indicator. In legitimate kidnapping cases, kidnappers typically maintain contact to facilitate ransom payment. The entire purpose of a kidnapping for ransom is to collect money, which requires ongoing communication to arrange payment logistics. The absence of any follow-up communication suggested that either the kidnappers had encountered problems, had been scared off by police presence, or that the ransom note was not genuine. However, the investigation was still proceeding under kidnapping assumptions. Detective Arndt was alone, waiting for backup that was slow to arrive. The Boulder Police Department's inexperience with major crimes became evident in their resource allocation and response coordination. At approximately 1 p.m., more than 7 hours after the 911 call, Detective Arndt made a decision that would irrevocably alter the investigation. Frustrated by the lack of contact from supposed kidnappers and needing to occupy the anxious family members, she suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White search the house again, looking for anything unusual or out of place. This decision represented another critical moment where standard investigative practice was abandoned, allowing potential suspects, because by this point, statistically speaking, family members had to be considered potential suspects to search for evidence in their own home violated basic crime scene protocols. If evidence existed, it should be found by trained investigators, not by people who might have motive to conceal or alter it. John and Fleet headed to the basement. They checked Burke's train room, where model trains were still set up on their tracks from Christmas play. They examined various storage areas. They looked at the broken basement window that John would later explain he had broken months earlier when locked out of the house. Then John walked directly to the wine cellar at the far end of the basement. He lifted the wooden latch and opened the door. This time he turned on the light. Inside, on the floor, was JonBenét's body. John's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He screamed a sound that Fleet White, standing behind him, would remember for the rest of his life. John saw his daughter lying on her back, covered with a white blanket. Duct tape covered her mouth. A white cord was tied around her neck, fashioned into what investigators would later term a garrote, with a broken paintbrush handle twisted into the ligature. Her hands were tied loosely above her head with more white cord. John immediately removed the duct tape from JonBenét's mouth, picked up her body, and carried her upstairs. This human response to finding his daughter destroyed critical crime scene evidence. The position of the body, the arrangement of items in the room, potential trace evidence, blood spatter patterns, fiber evidence, all of it was compromised the moment the body was moved. Detective Arndt, hearing the commotion, saw John emerge from the basement carrying JonBenet. She immediately recognized that this was no longer a kidnapping case. She checked for a pulse and found none. The child's body was cold and stiff. Rigor mortis had already set in, indicating death had occurred many hours earlier, probably during the night while everyone believed she had been kidnapped. At 1:05 p.m., JonBenet was officially pronounced dead. What had begun as a kidnapping investigation had become a homicide case, and the crime scene had been irreparably contaminated by hours of foot traffic and the movement of the victim's body. This moment crystallized the fundamental problem that would plague the investigation for decades. Critical evidence had been compromised before investigators understood they were dealing with a murder rather than a kidnapping. The realization that JonBenét had been in the house the entire time meant that the ransom note had served no functional purpose. It could not facilitate an actual kidnapping. It could not result in ransom payment. It could only serve as misdirection, either by an intruder attempting to confuse investigators or by someone inside the house attempting to create a false narrative about what had occurred. The autopsy performed on December 27th by Dr. John Meyer, Boulder County coroner, would provide crucial information about how JonBenét died, but also raise questions that remain unanswered decades later. The official cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. JonBenét had suffered both a severe skull fracture and strangulation by what investigators termed a garrote. The garrote was not a simple ligature. It was a device deliberately constructed from materials found in the house, white nylon cord of a type commonly available at hardware stores, and a broken handle from one of Patsy's paintbrushes. The construction required threading the cord around the stick and creating a mechanism that could be twisted to tighten the ligature. This was not something created in a moment of panic. It required planning and deliberate construction. The medical evidence suggested a timeline that was deeply disturbing. The skull fracture appeared to have occurred first, creating an 8.5-inch linear crack across the right side of JonBenét's head. The force required for this injury was substantial equivalent to falling from a 2-story building or being struck with significant force by a heavy object like a baseball bat or flashlight. This injury would have rendered JonBenét immediately unconscious. She would have collapsed without making a sound. However, the autopsy evidence suggested she survived this injury for an estimated 45 minutes to 2 hours before the strangulation occurred. During this interval, JonBenét was unconscious, but alive. Her heart was still beating, though weakly. Her breathing would have been shallow and irregular. To someone without medical training, she might have appeared dead, but she was clinging to life. The strangulation occurred sometime during this survival period. The garrote was applied and tightened until it cut off oxygen and compressed the carotid arteries, ultimately causing death. The presence of petechial hemorrhaging in JonBenét's eyes, small burst blood vessels, indicated she was still alive when the strangulation occurred, because this type of hemorrhaging requires a beating heart to develop. This timeline raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. What happened during the 45 minutes to 2 hours between the head injury and the strangulation? Was the garrote applied because someone realized JonBenét was still alive and wanted to ensure she died? Was it applied as staging to make the death appear to be the work of a sexual predator? Was it applied during a continuation of whatever assault had begun with the head injury? The gap between injuries suggests this was not a single moment of violence, but a sequence of events that unfolded over time. Someone had opportunity during that interval to call for medical help. Someone chose not to. The autopsy also revealed evidence that became the source of ongoing controversy. There was trauma to JonBenét's vaginal area, small abrasions, and a small amount of dried blood. The interpretation of this evidence has been heavily debated. Some experts who reviewed the autopsy materials concluded there was evidence of sexual assault on the night of the murder. Others suggested the injuries could have been from prior abuse. Still others argued the findings might have innocent explanations unrelated to sexual assault. Dr. Meyer noted in his autopsy report that he could not definitively determine whether sexual assault had occurred on the night of December 26th. The evidence was ambiguous, admitting multiple interpretations that would influence different theories about motive and perpetrator identity. Perhaps most significantly, the autopsy revealed partially digested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach and upper intestine. Based on the state of digestion, Dr. Meyer estimated that JonBenét had eaten pineapple approximately 1 to 2 hours before her death. This finding directly contradicted the parents' statements that JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from the Christmas party and had gone directly to bed without eating anything. If the estimated time of death was between midnight and 2 a.m., then JonBenét must have eaten pineapple sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. The significance of this contradiction became clear when investigators found a bowl of fresh pineapple on the kitchen table the morning of December 26th. The bowl contained pineapple chunks with a serving spoon. Fingerprint analysis revealed that the bowl bore the prints of Burke and Patsy Ramsey, but not JonBenét's fingerprints. This evidence suggested that JonBenét had been awake and downstairs after the family returned home, contradicting the timeline provided by her parents. Someone had served pineapple in that bowl. Someone had eaten from it. But the family's account did not include this activity. This discrepancy represents one of many contradictions between physical evidence and family statements that would never be satisfactorily resolved. Each contradiction required explanation, and the accumulation of unexplained contradictions would drive investigative focus toward family involvement rather than intruder theories. The ransom note itself presented numerous challenges that extended far beyond handwriting analysis. At 370 words across 2.5 pages, it was unusually long for a ransom demand. Analysis of genuine kidnapping cases reveals that most ransom notes are brief and direct, perhaps 5 to 10 sentences covering the essential information. We have your child, pay this amount, wait for instructions, don't call police. The JonBenét ransom note was rambling and theatrical. It included unnecessary details and what appeared to be references to movies. The opening paragraphs established an elaborate fictional scenario. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. This language suggested someone creating a narrative rather than documenting a real kidnapping. The note included phrases that forensic linguists later identified as similar to dialogue from movies like Speed and Dirty Harry. Don't try to grow a brain was nearly identical to a line from Speed. The overall tone and phrasing echoed crime thriller conventions rather than the direct, functional language typically found in genuine ransom demands. The note was written on paper from a legal pad found inside the Ramsey home, using a black felt-tip pen, also from inside the house. After the note was written, both the pad and pen were returned to their original locations in the kitchen. Crime scene investigators found what appeared to be a practice draft. In the same notepad, someone had started writing Mr. and Mrs. R, then stopped, torn out that page, and started over with Mr. Ramsey. This evidence suggested the writer had made a false start, reconsidered their approach, and began again. The implication was that someone had sat in the Ramsey house, comfortable enough to take time writing practice drafts of a ransom note. What intruder would have this kind of leisure time in a house where the family might wake up at any moment? The $118,000 demand was oddly specific, not a round number like $100,000 or $500,000, but a precise figure that almost exactly matched John Ramsey's recent bonus from Access Graphics. This insider knowledge raised immediate questions about who could have known this financial information, which was not public and would have been available only to family members, close business associates, or employees with access to executive compensation data. Handwriting analysis became a central focus of the investigation, but produced results that were more suggestive than conclusive. The Boulder Police Department brought in multiple experts to compare the ransom note to writing samples from family members and others who had access to the home. John Ramsey was definitively eliminated as the author of the note. Every expert who examined his handwriting samples agreed that he had not written the ransom note. The letter formations, spacing, pressure patterns, and overall style bore no resemblance to his natural writing. Patsy Ramsey could not be eliminated. 4 different handwriting experts examined her writing samples and reached varying conclusions. 2 experts said they could not rule out Patsy as the author. They found similarities in certain letter formations and writing characteristics that were consistent with her having written the note. However, they also found differences that prevented definitive attribution. 2 other experts concluded the evidence was inconclusive. They noted both similarities and differences, but felt the evidence was insufficient to make a determination either way. Significantly, no expert definitively stated that Patsy had written the ransom note. Independent handwriting analysts hired by the Ramsey family's defense team later concluded that Patsy had not written the note. They pointed to fundamental differences in letter formation, pressure patterns, and natural writing tendencies that they argued ruled her out as the author. This disagreement among experts illustrated a fundamental problem with handwriting analysis as forensic evidence. The same physical evidence, the same loops, slants, and letter formations could support different conclusions depending on which characteristics the analysts chose to emphasize. The subjectivity inherent in handwriting analysis meant it could not provide the definitive answers that investigators needed. The Boulder Police Department's response to these evidence contradictions established patterns that would characterize the investigation for years to come. Rather than treating each piece of evidence as part of an incomplete puzzle requiring additional investigation, investigators appear to develop theories and then interpret evidence to support those theories. This approach represents a common pitfall in criminal investigation known as confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, and recall information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs. Once investigators began to suspect family involvement, they interpreted ambiguous evidence as supporting that theory, while discounting evidence that suggested alternative explanations. By December 28th, just 2 days after the body was discovered, Boulder police had essentially concluded that the family was responsible for JonBenét's death. This conclusion was not based on definitive evidence proving family guilt, but on the combination of unusual circumstances: the ransom note written with materials from inside the house, the lack of clear signs of forced entry, contradictions between the family's timeline and physical evidence, and behavioral observations of how the family responded to the crisis. This early focus on the family represented another crucial turning point in the investigation. Once investigators committed to the theory of family involvement, other possibilities received progressively less attention. Potential intruder scenarios were not thoroughly investigated. Alternative suspects were not systematically pursued. The investigation developed what experts call tunnel vision, a narrowing of focus that can prevent investigators from recognizing evidence that contradicts their primary theory. The consequences of this tunnel vision extended beyond investigative strategy. It affected how evidence was collected, how witnesses were interviewed, and how resources were allocated. If investigators had remained open to multiple theories, they might have pursued different lines of investigation that could have provided alternative explanations for the contradictory evidence. The relationship between the Ramsey family and Boulder police deteriorated rapidly during this period. Within days of JonBenét's death, the family had hired criminal defense attorneys Brian Morgan and Patrick Burke. The attorneys' first advice was to limit cooperation with police, recognizing that the family had become the primary suspects, rather than grieving victims seeking their daughter's killer. This decision was legally prudent, but investigatively problematic. It created an adversarial dynamic where police interpreted the family's legal caution as evidence of guilt, while the family interpreted police focus as evidence of investigative incompetence or bias. Instead of working together to identify the perpetrator, they worked against each other, with each side protecting their own interests rather than pursuing truth. The adversarial relationship meant that critical investigative steps were delayed or conducted under confrontational circumstances. Formal interviews with family members were postponed for months while attorneys negotiated terms and conditions. When interviews finally occurred, they were conducted with lawyers present, strict time limits, and restrictions on certain topics. This legal maneuvering may have protected the family's constitutional rights, but it also prevented the kind of detailed, collaborative investigation that might have resolved contradictions in the timeline and evidence. The media attention that began almost immediately complicated every aspect of the investigation. Details that should have remained confidential were leaked to reporters within days of JonBenét's death. Tabloid newspapers and television programs transformed the case into entertainment, offering monetary rewards for inside information and encouraging speculation rather than factual reporting. The media coverage affected the investigation in multiple ways. It influenced potential witnesses, who now had preconceived notions about what had happened based on television coverage rather than their own observations. It affected the family's behavior, as they found themselves under constant scrutiny and had to consider how their actions would be interpreted by a hostile press. Most problematically, media coverage influenced public opinion, creating pressure on investigators to produce results quickly rather than conducting thorough, methodical investigation. Some leaked information was accurate but should have remained confidential to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Other leaked information was inaccurate, creating public impressions of guilt or innocence that were not supported by actual evidence. The combination of accurate and inaccurate leaks made it difficult for the public and potential jurors to distinguish between verified facts and speculation. The media circus also provided the Ramsey family and their attorneys with information about the direction of the investigation. Details about evidence collection, witness interviews, and investigative theories appeared in newspapers before they were officially communicated to the defense. This gave the family's legal team advance notice of where the investigation was headed, allowing them to prepare responses and defensive strategies. Perhaps most corrosively, the media attention transformed the investigation from a search for truth into a public relations battle. Both sides, police and the Ramsey family, began making strategic communications decisions based on how information would play in the press, rather than how it would advance the investigation. Truth became secondary to perception management. In September 1998, nearly 2 years after JonBenét's death, a grand jury was convened to examine all available evidence and determine whether criminal charges should be filed. Grand juries are intended to be independent bodies of citizens who can evaluate evidence without the institutional pressures that affect police and prosecutors. 23 Boulder County residents were selected to hear testimony and review documents. For 13 months, the grand jury examined evidence in detail. They heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, including police officers, forensic experts, family members, and friends. They reviewed crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, handwriting analysis, and DNA test results. They examined the physical evidence, the ransom note, the garrote, clothing fibers, and trace evidence collected from the scene. The grand jury process was conducted in secret, as required by law. But participants later indicated that the jurors took their responsibilities seriously. They asked detailed questions about evidence interpretation. They requested clarification about forensic findings. They appeared genuinely committed to following the evidence wherever it led. In October 1999, after 13 months of investigation, the grand jury voted. They voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey not for murder, but for child abuse, resulting in death and for being accessories to a crime. The indictment language was carefully crafted and legally significant. It stated that the Ramseys had unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permitted JonBenét to be placed in a situation that posed a threat to her life, which resulted in her death. It also stated that they had rendered assistance to a person with intent to hinder the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of that person for the commission of murder. This language suggested the grand jury believed someone in the house had harmed JonBenét and that John and Patsy Ramsey had helped cover it up. They were not accused of directly causing JonBenét's death, but of permitting conditions that led to her death and then assisting in a cover-up to protect the actual perpetrator. The implications were profound. After hearing all available evidence for over a year, 23 citizens concluded that the parents bore legal responsibility for their daughter's death and had engaged in criminal conduct to conceal what had happened. This was not a decision based on media speculation or public opinion, but on careful examination of evidence under oath. However, District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment. At a press conference on the 13th of October, 1999, Hunter announced that the grand jury had completed their work and that insufficient evidence existed to warrant prosecution. He stated that the grand jury had voted no true bill, implying they had found no basis for criminal charges. This statement was misleading. The grand jury had actually voted to indict, but Hunter had made the prosecutorial decision not to move forward with charges. His reasoning, explained years later, was that he believed the evidence was insufficient to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. The case was entirely circumstantial. Defense attorneys would challenge every piece of evidence as potentially contaminated or misinterpreted. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The DNA evidence, while suggestive of an unknown perpetrator, was not definitive. Hunter knew that if he brought charges and lost at trial, double jeopardy would prevent the case from ever being prosecuted again, even if new evidence emerged. By not filing charges, he kept the case officially open and preserved the possibility of future prosecution if stronger evidence developed. This decision represented yet another moment where the investigation's direction was fundamentally altered. The grand jury, after the most thorough examination of evidence in the case's history, had concluded that criminal charges were warranted. Their decision was overruled by prosecutorial discretion, effectively ending any immediate possibility of resolution through the criminal justice system. The true grand jury decision remained secret for 14 years. It wasn't until 2013 that reporter Charlie Brennan sued to have the indictment documents unsealed, revealing that the grand jury had actually voted to indict the parents. This revelation forced a reassessment of everything that had been publicly known about the case. The official narrative that insufficient evidence existed even for an indictment was false. The secrecy surrounding the grand jury decision illustrates how criminal justice institutions can prioritize legal strategy over public accountability. District Attorney Hunter's decision may have been legally sound, but it left the public with incomplete information about what the evidence actually showed when examined by an independent body. DNA evidence emerged as a potentially transformative factor beginning in 1997, when forensic scientists found genetic material from an unknown male on JonBenét's underwear. This DNA did not match anyone in the Ramsey family, anyone who had been in the house on December 25th or 26th, or anyone else who had been investigated in connection with the case. The DNA was found mixed with JonBenét's blood in the crotch area of the underwear she was wearing when her body was discovered. When this genetic profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, containing profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees across the country, no match was found. Whoever this DNA belonged to was not in the criminal database. Initially, some investigators and prosecutors dismissed this DNA evidence as potentially irrelevant. They theorized it could have been deposited during manufacturing processes, from factory workers or others who handled the clothing before it was purchased. Since the underwear was new and had never been washed, innocent transfer during production seemed possible. However, this interpretation became more difficult to sustain as DNA technology advanced. In 2003, more sophisticated testing techniques were applied to additional items of JonBenét's clothing. Touch DNA analysis, a method that can extract genetic material from tiny amounts of skin cells left by touching objects, revealed additional unknown male DNA on the waistband of the long underwear JonBenet was wearing over her regular underwear. Crucially, this DNA appeared to match the DNA found on the regular underwear. The same unknown male's genetic profile was present in 2 different locations on 2 separate items of clothing. This made innocent transfer during manufacturing much less likely, because it would require the same person to have handled both items during production processes that typically occur at different facilities. The presence of matching DNA in multiple locations suggested that someone had physically handled JonBenet, coming into direct contact with both items of clothing she was wearing. If this DNA came from her killer, it provided a clear investigative lead. If it came from innocent transfer unrelated to the crime, it represented a significant red herring that could mislead the investigation. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacy made an unprecedented decision based on this DNA evidence. She issued a formal letter officially exonerating the Ramsey family of any involvement in JonBenet's death. The letter stated, "The match of male DNA on 2 separate items of clothing worn by the victim at the time of the murder makes it clear to us that an unknown male handled these items. There is no innocent explanation for its incriminating presence at 2 locations on these 2 different items of clothing worn by the victim at the time of her death." Lacy's letter went further, apologizing to the Ramsey family for the years of suspicion they had endured and acknowledging that the investigation had focused too heavily on family involvement while not adequately pursuing intruder theories. She declared that future investigations should concentrate on identifying the unknown male whose DNA was found at the crime scene. This exoneration was groundbreaking but controversial. For the first time in 12 years, the family was officially cleared of suspicion by law enforcement. However, many investigators and forensic experts strongly disagreed with Lacey's conclusions and the breadth of her exoneration. Critics argued that the DNA evidence, while significant, was not as conclusive as Lacey claimed. The amount of genetic material was extremely small, measured in picograms, which represents trillions of times smaller than typical DNA samples. Touch DNA at this level can transfer in unexpected ways and persist on clothing through multiple handling events. More fundamentally, critics noted that even if the DNA came from an unknown perpetrator, it did not resolve other evidence contradictions. The ransom note was still written using materials from inside the house by someone with intimate knowledge of John Ramsey's finances. The lack of clear signs of forced entry remained unexplained. The contradictions between the family's timeline and the pineapple evidence were still unresolved. The Boulder Police Department publicly disagreed with the exoneration, issuing statements that the case remained open, with all theories still on the table. This disagreement between the district attorney's office and police highlighted ongoing institutional conflicts about evidence interpretation that had characterized the case from its beginning. The DNA evidence illustrates a fundamental challenge in forensic science. The same physical evidence can support different theories, depending on how it is interpreted and what weight is given to various possibilities. The DNA could indicate an unknown perpetrator who killed JonBenét, and whose identity, once determined, would resolve the case. Alternatively, it could represent innocent transfer that occurred at some point before the crime and had no connection to the murder. Without additional context, such as the DNA being found under JonBenét's fingernails, indicating a struggle, or being present in much larger quantities, suggesting direct involvement in the assault, the DNA alone cannot definitively resolve these competing interpretations. Recent advances in genetic genealogy have offered new possibilities for investigating the unknown DNA profile. This technique, which gained prominence after the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, uses DNA evidence not just to search criminal databases, but to search public genealogy databases, where millions of people have uploaded their genetic profiles to trace ancestry. Even if the perpetrator's DNA is not in criminal databases, genetic genealogy can potentially identify distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, or other family connections who share genetic markers with the unknown profile. Investigators can then build family trees, working backward and forward through generations to identify individuals whose DNA might match the crime scene evidence. In 2021, the Boulder Police Department announced they were working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and outside forensic genealogy experts to apply this technology to the JonBenét case. The process involves uploading the unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases and searching for potential family connections. This work is painstaking and time-consuming. Genetic genealogy investigations can take months or years, depending on how many potential matches are found and how extensive the family trees become. Each potential connection must be researched, documented, and either eliminated or pursued further. The results of genetic genealogy testing in the JonBenét case have not been publicly disclosed. Boulder Police Chief Maris Harold announced in December 2022 that the department was working with state and federal partners to use all available resources and technology to investigate the case, but no arrests or identification of suspects has resulted from these efforts. The application of genetic genealogy to the case represents the latest attempt to use advancing technology to resolve questions that have remained unanswered for decades. However, even if genetic genealogy succeeds in identifying the source of the unknown DNA, significant challenges would remain in building a prosecutable case. First, investigators would need to place the identified person at the Ramsey home on December 25, 2H, 26, 2H, 1996. DNA evidence alone especially in small quantities, does not necessarily prove presence during the commission of a crime. Defense attorneys could argue that DNA transfer occurred through some other mechanism unrelated to the murder. Second, prosecutors would need to explain how an outsider gained access to the house, navigated its complex layout, located JonBenét, committed the crime, and constructed the garrote using materials from inside the house, all without leaving additional physical evidence or disturbing the family. Third, they would need to account for the ransom note, how an intruder knew John Ramsey's bonus amount, why they took time to write a lengthy note using household materials, and why they left it behind when the supposed kidnapping never occurred. These challenges illustrate why DNA evidence, while valuable, is rarely sufficient by itself to resolve complex criminal cases. Physical evidence must be integrated with behavioral analysis, witness testimony, and logical reconstruction of events to build a comprehensive understanding of what occurred. The institutional failures that characterize the JonBenét Ramsey investigation extend beyond individual mistakes or incompetence. They reflect systematic problems with how criminal investigations are structured and how evidence is interpreted when it does not conform to standard patterns. Criminal justice systems are designed around certain assumptions: that crime scenes will be preserved, that evidence will point toward a limited number of suspects, that witness testimony will be generally reliable, and that physical evidence will support coherent narratives about what occurred. When these assumptions prove false, the system struggles to adapt. In the JonBenét case, each assumption was violated. The crime scene was contaminated before investigators understood they were dealing with a homicide. Evidence pointed in multiple directions, without clearly eliminating any possibilities. Witness testimony contained contradictions that were never resolved. Physical evidence supported competing theories without definitively confirming any single explanation. The adversarial nature of criminal justice, which assumes that truth emerges through confrontation between prosecution and defense, broke down when the evidence was too ambiguous to support confident prosecution. Without charges being filed, there was no formal mechanism for testing evidence, interpretations, or resolving contradictions. The investigation also suffered from institutional pressures that prioritized rapid resolution over thorough investigation. Media attention created public demands for quick answers. Police administrators needed to demonstrate progress to maintain credibility. Prosecutors faced pressure to either file charges or publicly explain why charges were not appropriate. These pressures encouraged investigators to commit to theories before they had sufficient evidence to support them. Once committed, confirmation bias led to interpretation of subsequent evidence in ways that supported those theories rather than challenging them. The case demonstrates how investigative tunnel vision can become self-reinforcing. When investigators focus on particular suspects, they direct resources toward building cases against those suspects rather than exploring alternatives. Evidence that supports the favored theory receives emphasis, while evidence that contradicts it is minimized or explained away. This dynamic is particularly problematic in cases where early evidence is contaminated or ambiguous, because investigators may commit to theories based on incomplete information and then resist changing direction even when new evidence emerges. Perhaps most significantly, the case illustrates the limitations of evidence-based decision-making when evidence itself is contradictory. Criminal investigations assume that accumulating more evidence will eventually lead to clarity. But in some cases, additional evidence can increase rather than reduce uncertainty by revealing new contradictions or alternative explanations. The JonBenét investigation generated enormous amounts of evidence: thousands of photographs, hundreds of witness interviews, extensive forensic analysis, DNA testing and retesting, handwriting analysis by multiple experts, and behavioral analysis by FBI profilers. Yet this abundance of evidence failed to produce the clarity that victims, families, and society expect from criminal investigation. This outcome challenges fundamental assumptions about how truth emerges from investigation. More investigation does not necessarily mean better understanding. More evidence does not automatically lead to resolution. In cases where multiple theories remain consistent with available evidence, additional information can sometimes preserve rather than eliminate uncertainty. 28 years after JonBenét Ramsey's death, the case remains officially unsolved. Multiple district attorneys have overseen continuing investigation. Hundreds of investigators have worked on various aspects of the case. Over 21,000 tips have been received and investigated. Advanced DNA technology, unavailable in 1996, has been applied to physical evidence multiple times. Yet fundamental questions remain unanswered. The physical evidence contains contradictions that have never been resolved. The behavioral evidence admits multiple interpretations. The forensic evidence, while extensive, has not produced definitive conclusions about perpetrator identity or the sequence of events on December 25, TH 26TH 1996. Current Boulder Police Chief Maris Harold has stated that the case remains an active investigation, with detectives continuing to follow leads and apply new technology as it becomes available. The department maintains a dedicated tip line and regularly issues public appeals for information. In December 2024, marking the 28th anniversary of JonBenét's death, investigators announced they had processed additional DNA evidence and were pursuing new leads, though no details were provided. The persistence of investigative activity after nearly 3 decades reflects both the high-profile nature of the case and genuine hope that advancing technology might eventually provide answers. However, it also illustrates the challenge of maintaining investigative momentum when years pass without significant breakthroughs. The case has become a study in how unsolved investigations evolve over time. Initial urgency gives way to methodical, long-term investigation. Original investigators retire and are replaced by new personnel who must familiarize themselves with decades of accumulated evidence. Witnesses age, move away, or die. Physical evidence degrades. Memory becomes less reliable. These factors create additional obstacles to resolution, even as technology advances. The advantages of new forensic techniques must be weighed against the disadvantages of time passage and evidence deterioration. The human cost of the unresolved investigation extends far beyond the original tragedy. JonBenét's parents lived under suspicion for the rest of their lives. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has spent 3 decades defending his family's innocence and advocating for continued investigation. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, 2 years before the DNA exoneration, never seeing her name officially cleared. Burke Ramsey grew up under public scrutiny and continuing speculation about his potential involvement. Despite being cleared by investigators and having no evidence linking him to his sister's death, online theories and media speculation have followed him into adulthood, affecting his ability to live normally. The extended family, friends, and community members who tried to help during the initial crisis have also carried the weight of unanswered questions. Some have questioned whether their actions inadvertently harmed the investigation. Others have wondered whether they missed signs that could have prevented the tragedy. The Boulder community itself was changed by the case. The image of a safe, affluent college town was shattered by the realization that such violence could occur in their midst. Trust in local institutions was damaged by perceived investigative failures. The intense media attention transformed Boulder into a symbol of something disturbing rather than the peaceful mountain community residents knew. These ongoing consequences illustrate why case resolution matters beyond abstract concepts of justice. Unresolved cases leave wounds that continue to affect individuals and communities long after initial media attention fades. The JonBenét Ramsey case also highlights the complex relationship between public fascination and investigative integrity. High-profile cases generate enormous public interest, which can provide resources and attention that aid investigation. However, public attention also creates pressures that can interfere with methodical police work. The case has been the subject of dozens of books, documentaries, television specials, and podcasts. Each new treatment promises to reveal previously unknown information or present definitive theories about what happened. While some of these efforts have contributed valuable analysis or brought attention to overlooked evidence, others have perpetuated speculation and misinformation. The proliferation of theories, some based on evidence, others on speculation, has made it increasingly difficult for the public to distinguish between established facts and conjecture. This confusion can affect potential witnesses, who may struggle to separate their own memories from information they have encountered in media coverage. The democratization of information through the internet has amplified these effects. Online forums and social media platforms allow anyone to present theories and analysis, regardless of their expertise or access to actual evidence. While this openness can sometimes generate useful insights, it also creates echo chambers where unsupported theories can gain credibility through repetition rather than verification. The challenge for law enforcement is maintaining investigative focus while managing public expectations and filtering useful information from the enormous volume of speculation and misinformation that surrounds high-profile cases. As we approach the case's 30th anniversary, several developments may influence its eventual resolution or continued status as an unsolved investigation. Advances in DNA technology continue to provide new possibilities for analyzing existing evidence. Genetic genealogy techniques are becoming more sophisticated and may eventually identify the source of the unknown DNA profile found at the crime scene. However, the passage of time also creates new obstacles. Key figures in the original investigation have retired or died. Witnesses who might have provided crucial information may no longer be alive or may have impaired memory. Physical evidence continues to degrade despite careful preservation efforts. The most significant factor may be changing institutional approaches to cold case investigation. Modern police departments have developed specialized units and protocols specifically designed for reviewing unsolved cases with fresh perspectives. These units can sometimes identify investigative avenues that were overlooked during initial investigation, or recognize how new technology might be applied to existing evidence. The Boulder Police Department has indicated that such approaches are being applied to the JonBenét case, though specific details remain confidential to protect investigative integrity. From an analytical perspective, the case serves as a comprehensive example of how multiple systemic failures can compound to prevent resolution of criminal investigations. The initial contamination of the crime scene, the early focus on particular suspects, the adversarial relationship between investigators and the victim's family, the media interference, the institutional pressures for quick resolution, and the challenges of interpreting ambiguous evidence all contributed to the case remaining unsolved. No single failure was determinative. Each problem was manageable individually. However, the combination of multiple failures created a situation where resolution became progressively more difficult as time passed and positions became entrenched. This dynamic suggests that preventing such outcomes requires systematic attention to investigative protocols, rather than simply improving individual components of the criminal justice system. Crime scene preservation, evidence collection, suspect development, media management, and interagency coordination must all function effectively for complex investigations to succeed. The case also demonstrates the limitations of applying standard investigative approaches to unusual circumstances. Most homicide cases involve clear evidence of how the victim died, obvious suspects with established motives, and physical evidence that supports coherent narratives about what occurred. When these standard elements are absent or contradictory, investigators may struggle to adapt their approaches effectively. The institutional learning that has occurred as a result of the JonBenét case has influenced how similar investigations are conducted. Police departments across the country have studied the case as an example of what can go wrong when protocols are not followed or when unusual circumstances challenge standard approaches. Training programs for investigators now routinely include case studies based on the JonBenét investigation, focusing on crime scene preservation, media management, and the dangers of tunnel vision in complex cases. While this cannot undo the failures in the original investigation, it may help prevent similar problems in future cases. The question of whether the JonBenét Ramsey case will ever be resolved remains open. Technological advances continue to provide new investigative possibilities. Cold case review processes may identify previously overlooked evidence or investigative approaches. Someone with crucial information may decide to come forward after decades of silence. However, resolution is is not guaranteed. Some cases remain unsolved despite extensive investigation and technological advancement. The passage of time creates obstacles that cannot be overcome through investigative effort alone. Evidence degrades, witnesses become unavailable, and memories fade. The case may eventually be resolved through identification of the unknown DNA profile, discovery of previously unknown evidence, or emergence of new witness testimony. Alternatively, it may remain permanently unsolved, serving as a reminder of the limitations of criminal investigation when confronted with ambiguous evidence and institutional failure. What seems certain is that the case will continue to generate public interest and investigative activity for years to come. The combination of a child victim, wealthy family, unusual circumstances, and institutional failures has created a mystery that captures public imagination in ways that more straightforward cases do not. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when she died in her family's Boulder home on December 26, 1996. She was a child who loved performing, who sang in her church choir, who was preparing for a Christmas pageant, and who had dreams that will never be fulfilled. Her death launched one of the most extensive criminal investigations in American history. Thousands of hours of investigative work, hundreds of interviews, advanced forensic analysis, and decades of continued effort have failed to provide definitive answers about what happened during the crucial hours of December 25, TH 26, TH 1996. The case demonstrates how evidence can accumulate without producing clarity, how institutional failures can compound to prevent resolution, and how some questions may resist answer despite unlimited resources and persistent effort. It illustrates the gap between what society expects from criminal investigation and what investigation can actually deliver when confronted with ambiguous evidence and unusual circumstances. Most fundamentally, it shows how truth can remain elusive, even when it seems within reach, hidden somewhere in the intersection between what we can know and what we can prove, between what the evidence suggests and what it can definitively establish. The investigation continues, but certainty remains distant, a reminder that some cases exist beyond the reach of resolution, regardless of effort, resources, or the passage of time.